Welcome to another episode of Fougere Family Adventures. Today is episode 3 of my How to Salmon Fish series. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel. Now in this episode, I would like to touch on float fishing. There are many different floats that you can purchase on the market. Here is the type of float that I've been using recently. This is a 25 gram D&E float, and these floats can be purchased at any local fishing store. Now, float fishing is one of the most effective and productive methods of salmon fishing. If you learn how to float fish, you will be able to target all the species of salmon. You can even use floats for targeting rainbow trout in a river, and they work extremely well. So this float here is a pass-through float, or there's a hole right in the middle of the float, and it slides on my line. You can see here, it slides on my line. So we need to be able to keep this in place to set our depth, and to do that, I have 2 bobber stops on the very top of the float. There are different styles of bobber stops that you can purchase at a fishing store. I like these little rubber ones. Now in low light conditions, when we get into coho season, some people will put a fluorescent corky or bead on the top of this float, then your bobber stops, and it will allow you to see your float a little easier in those first hours of daylight. There are many different floats on the market. You can get white floats like this. This is what I prefer. You can get black floats. You can get clear floats. Now, some people like to use clear floats when they're targeting steelhead and coho. They believe that it helps them catch more fish because the fish does not see the float in the water as much. If you're fishing in the Fraser Valley, there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of floats in the water. And if you can reduce your visibility, you may increase your chances of catching a fish. Now, for the purpose of what we're doing, when you are pink salmon fishing, when you are chum fishing, chinook fishing, a white float will do the trick. One thing to know, you can get very technical with this. These floats are weighted, so this is 25 grams. That means you need to use an equal amount of weight to balance this float. And what that means is when this float is in the water, it should be straight up and down like this. And you should only see the top of the float like that. The rest should be under the water. And this should be floating down the river. When I cast, I should see this floating nice and straightly. If the float is laying down like this on the water and going down the water, you have too much line set from the float to your weight. And that just means that you are bouncing the bottom. You're bottom bouncing with the float, and the float is serving no purpose. If the river is going this way and the float's floating this way, it's great. You can touch your spool ever so slightly and the float will come back at you, and it will lift your weight off the bottom ever so slightly. If the float is going this way, if it's drifting down the river and it goes this way and points downstream, you are hung up on bottom, and you need to readjust how much line you have from your float to your weight. That about sums up the floats. The only thing I need to mention is there are older style floats that I do like. They stopped making them. I can't find them for some reason. And they have plastic that comes in the float here, and you wrap your line around and it goes down another piece of plastic, and it secures your float in place without using bobber stops. I really like those floats. I just can't find them as often anymore. Now, there are different weight setups that you can use. I use the exact same pencil lead and the exact same setup as I do when I'm bottom bouncing. So if you want to learn how to tie this, take a look at episode 1, and I will show you how to tie this pencil lead setup. There are people that will use this pencil lead with a hole in it, put it on your main line, put a bead and then a swivel, and then have your leader below that. I don't really like that. I've tried it, but the pencil lead itself can cut your line and fray your line as it's going down the water. Another method that guys are using to weight down their float is they use split shots. They have a bunch of split shots in a row and it works for them. I prefer pencil lead. You need to adjust your float from the weight to the float so that your weight is just tapping the bottom. You want to be tap, tap, tap as you go down the river. You can free spool your float, which means to hit the release and let your line go down the river. But if you're fishing with other people, be mindful of not to free spool too far down the river. So when you're float fishing, your leader length should be short. Anywhere from 12 to 24 inches. I usually end up between 18 and 24, sometimes longer. You want a short leader. That's about the length of my leader. Now to measure my leader length, I just take a length, measure it out, hold the end, and go to about my armpit. I cut that, and that's my length. Then I know I can reduce my leader a little bit as I go if I need to retie my hook, and I don't have to change out my full leader. Now having a shorter leader when you're float fishing is more effective than say a 6-foot leader like I see out there sometimes. A shorter leader will transfer the fish bite to your float quicker. You will be able to react quicker on that fish before he spits out your bait or your yarn or your corky or whatever you're using, whatever you're allowed to use at the time. So the first thing I want to talk about is safety on the rocks. Chances are you will end up in an area like this. Now in episode 1, we talked about banks and gravel banks that slope nicely, gravel banks that come down, the potential dangers of slipping into a river. Now I want to show you different dangers here. The water is faster, the edge is very slippery, all these rocks. The rocks here actually can slide on you, they can move. So be careful of what you're stepping on. I like to find a comfortable rock that's nice and flat to stand on. Something that's not going to move, give it a little wiggle, be careful, be ready to slip or fall. Get anchored and make sure you're safe. Now the good part about float fishing is I can stand further away from the water and still be successful and efficient, and I could be safer further away back. I could be higher up on the bank, which gives me a higher vantage point for floating this float down the river. Now the rods we like to use for float fishing are longer rods. This is my float fishing rod. This rod's about 20 years old. Again, all my rods are 20 years old. This is a Fenwick. You can see here that it looks like my float is touching my weight, and it is. My float slides. I have those bobber stops, and they're about here. So I have my length about 2.5, 3 feet. If I want to adjust my float, I pull up a bobber stop, I pull up the second bobber stop. But that is as far as my float can slide to. And so when it goes into the river, the weight slides down and we're at the top of my float. So I got about 3.5, 4 feet of weight. Now when you're casting, you can cast multiple ways. You can pull your bobber stops into your guides, but sometimes it doesn't flow out nicely. If you got enough, this is why I like the wraparound float, you have the length of line to your float. With a wraparound, you have it up there and you have your weight down here. The bobber stops are a little bit more difficult. Now when I'm casting, I can underhand cast like this when I'm not casting too far, keep my rod tip up and let it flow down the river. I free spool and I let my float go down the river. Don't go too far though, because you might end up hooking someone. Now I'm by myself, so I could free float or free spool down this river quite a bit, but it's unnecessary. If you're by yourself, walk the bank, go for a walk, make a couple casts, move on to the next hole. I can, like I said, underhand cast like this. I can let it go. I can, if I'm trying to cast across a river, I can overhand cast like this. Watch the rocks behind you. Watch the rocks, watch the trees. Another reason why a shorter leader is more effective float fishing, especially on a bank. So in episode 2, we talked about bottom bouncing with float fishing. And bottom bouncing with float anglers does not work. If you're float fishing, as you can see, I don't know if you can see it, but your float goes straight down the river. If you're bottom bouncing, the weight actually arcs down the river and you get tangled up with people who are float fishing a lot easier. So there you go, that's what I'm using. So again, cast out. As soon as it hits the water, I keep my line free spooling, and I can free spool and let my float go down the water. As soon as it hits the water, I want to make sure, especially if I'm casting a long distance, let's say I'm casting a long distance, I want to keep my rod up right away, and I want my line from the tip of my rod to the top of my float. I don't want line touching the water. If my line is touching the water, it gives unnecessary drag to my float, and it doesn't allow a proper hook set on a fish when the bobber goes down. Now it's difficult to show you the float hanging up on bottom, but if I was, let's see if I can do it. If I was deeper than I need to be in this area, I haven't felt bottom yet. This is a bad example for an area to show you bottom because it is very quick in here. I'm gonna go up 2 feet and see if I can feel the bottom. So my bobber stop is there. That's how deep I'm gonna be. So I will cast out. I will let out some lines so that my bobber stops go, and I'm dragging bottom. So now my float has turned and it's pointing downstream. I need to adjust the length from my float to my weight. So I will go again, I will adjust it back down a foot, and keep going until you feel your weight just tapping the bottom. We'll cast again, and that's better. We'll talk about different species and how they run in the water, but quickly, springs like fast deep water, chum like nice deep water, fast water as well. Coho like deeper, slower pools, deeper, slower water. Pinks and sockeye will sometimes run up the edge of a river, but sockeye can also be out in the middle. So the advantages of float fishing is you can fish longer if your float is set up properly without snagging bottom. You can float fish through snaggy areas because you can direct your float in and amongst those areas and reduce how many times you snag bottom. And in turn, it reduces your waste in the river and it saves you money in the long run. Now, when you're casting for float fishing, it is ideal to cast a little bit upriver, and that allows your weight to sink and your float to set up properly for your float. Cast upriver, allow your weight to sink, make sure your float is up and down in the water, straight up and down. If your float is pointing downriver, shorten up the distance from your float to your weight. And if your float is flat on the water, shorten it up a lot more because that means you got way too much line out. I just had a bird's nest because I was not paying attention. And the best part about float fishing, you can let all your line out and it will fix itself for you on a long run like this. I'm fixed, now I'm gonna reel in. And now I snag bottom. So when you snag bottom with the float, there's a few things you could do to get it loose. Let out some line. It will help pop that lead out. Give it a couple pops, let out some line, and it might help free up your weight, which is usually what's hooked, from the bottom. So I made this video with the intention of giving you a very quick introduction of float fishing, giving you as many tips as I possibly can. The best advice I can give you, like I have told you before, get outside, go fishing, and make sure you let others know that you're new to this. There are a lot of great anglers out there, and a lot of people will help you learn how to float fish correctly. It's also going to be in people's best interests, if you let them know that you're new, to teach you, because they don't want to be hooking your line, having to get out of the water to untangle things, having to retie. So just talk nicely. Hey, I'm new to this. Can you help me? When you're casting with multiple anglers, if you're not fortunate like this stretch of river right now, make sure before you cast upriver, you're looking for floats in the water so that you're not casting on top of somebody's float. Now, if the float is gone past you, you can cast past them, but as soon as you cast past them, get your rod up, don't let your line touch their line, keep your rod in the air and let it drift down the river. When your drift is over, just like bottom bouncing, put your rod down so that everybody can still keep fishing and reel in with your rod down. This helps us all work together and it makes us efficient and it reduces our tangles. Now, common lures or common things to use on the end of your line when float fishing are corkies, spinning glows, wool, yarn. I love yarn when I'm fishing for coho. I love trying to figure out that magical color. I love trying to figure out what mixtures of yarn or wool they're going to bite at. Typically I start with peaches, but it's not always peach that a coho wants. So that's exciting. You need to be tapping that bottom. Don't drag. Make sure you're tapping the bottom as you're going down river. If you're tapping the bottom, your yarn will stay close to the fish zone. They will come up and bite it. Something else to keep in mind if you're fishing with roe in those areas or rivers of British Columbia that you're allowed to use bait or roe, your roe is going to be heavier and it's going to sink down. So you actually, in this case, don't want to be tapping the bottom very often. You want to know where the bottom is, so find it first and then set your float so that your weight is actually higher than the bottom and your roe bag is drifting a foot to a foot and a half off the bottom. So you're not going to feel bottom, but you need to constantly find bottom and then pull that roe up off the bottom. I hope this video has helped you. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel. And one more tip about float fishing and float fishing on banks like this is if you need a break and you want to kick back, sit down, you got plenty of seats available on the rocks compared to when you're fishing on a beach. You can sit down. Now, if this video has helped you, please subscribe to my channel. Please hit the notification bell. Please comment on my videos if you want to learn more, or maybe you can help me learn more. And most importantly, stay tuned for my next How to Salmon Fish video coming soon.